All right. So this is the first one of How Did You Do That? We have Sandra is still here moderating the chat.
Hey.
And we have our guest today showing us how to do that. She's going to be walking us through how to make puppets. She is a comic artist. She has her own line of books. We will talk to her about all of that and much more. Here is Katie from Dragon Child.
Hello.
Yay!
Okay, got something for you.
Nice.
There we go.
I was going to say, as you can see behind me, I have all sorts of fun stuff.
Would you like to tell us
a little bit about myself?
First of all, you are making dragons.
I am. So
you make dragons, and
this is what one of the finished ones look like. They are hand puppets. They all have names, and they're all characters from my comic. And they are primarily made out of minky fabric with plastic safety eyes that I get clear, and then I paint the backs of them with metallic paint. But I design them to look like my characters, but also function for a puppet that will fit most people's hands. That's one of the things that, you know, when you're designing lots of other plush things, you don't necessarily need to worry about the functionality of the thing. But for puppets, one of the big, most important things was, can it fit my hand, and can it fit other people's hands comfortably and be an enjoyable puppet? I have a partial version of one of the pieces that's completely inside out, so it looks ridiculous, of my big dragon. So I make, and before I ever started doing the puppets, I started making these big 44-inch from head to tail big stuffed plush dragons. And inevitably, when I would make them, I would always do this, where I would put it on my hand as a puppet, but it was a little bit too small to function adequately as a puppet in practice, partially due to the fact that there was barely room for my hand in there, let alone stuffing. Sometimes with puppets, you'll use stuffing, other times you'll use foam. This Kermit behind me is a replica that I made myself. He's got a combination of foam and stuffing, but primarily foam. His head actually right now would normally be open kind of like this in a perpetual scream, but I put a little bit of stuffing in his head to make him not look completely insane. But for my purposes, I basically started with the design that I made for my big dragons. So this is an unstuffed version of the same character that I made as a puppet. So she's pretty darn big as a completely unstuffed, ridiculous looking skin. But, you know, inevitably, the pattern pieces are almost identical between the big dragons and the puppets, just scaled up to actually fit human hands. I've never tested it specifically to be sized for children. But I've found that even my sized up one that's specifically designed to fit hands bigger than myself will fit on the tiniest children without any issue. So it's more a matter of, you know, is there enough internal structure and stuffing to kind of, you know, cover your hand to where you're not, you know, losing the ability to use it as a hand puppet while still having a lot of space for someone who has a big enough hand to where that would stop them from being able to use the puppet. Another thing that I took into consideration was the type of material that I wanted to use for the mouth plate. So when you have a puppet, typically there's some sort of structure that goes into the top and the bottom of the mouth. And it will, you know, typically either be something that's a little bit flexible or completely and utterly inflexible. And I ended up going with a material that is a Pellin product. I have the type literally pasted to my wall, so I'm looking over at that right now. It's a Peltex 71F. It's a single-sided fusible ultra firm stabilizer. And all that really means is that one side of this has these little bumps that you can see. There's a little bit of a texture there versus this side is smooth, to where you, using a wet cloth over the top of it, you can iron that material onto the inside of the puppet mouth. And so at the stage that this, you know, full big stuffed dragon mouth is at, I would essentially take, at this midline, the lower mouth plate would go here, the upper mouth plate would go up on the top, and there would just need to be enough of a seam around that to where it's not going to push out past whatever the structure of the mouth is. And so if you're using, you know, a size that doesn't match, so if I show you like this, so this side goes in here, this side goes on the bottom, and you know, depending on the type of puppet that you're making, that's, you know, size is going to change, but the most important thing is it flexible, and you know, what size do you want to have on the upper and the lower depending on the shape of the mouth. My dragons have very narrow faces, so the mouth plates that go with them are adequately narrow as well. A lot of times people will end up with a more Muppet style where it's, you know, essentially a half circle. But you know, whenever you're designing your pattern pieces, it's got to fit with whatever, you know, shape you're designing. And for me, the other thing I was, you know, thinking about is I want to have space in the lower jaw for my thumb, and then the upper hand is going to be on the upper half of the jaw. So, you know, there's tons of space, but sometimes people will even, you know, have things with the eyes where, you know, you have fingers dealing with that. In my case, it's literally just, you know, open and close with thumb in the top of the hand. So that is going to be how that works. Now for pattern making, depending on what you're trying to build, I always start with what's called freezer paper. But you can use parchment paper, you can use just a big roll of any type of paper. The reason that I started with freezer paper to begin with is that one side of it, similar to the fusible material I use for the mouth plates, you can actually iron on to your fabric if you're cutting out single pieces at a time. For me, what I tend to do is I cut out doubles of almost every single piece that I'm making. So I actually use a bunch of safety pins, so little straight pins, to essentially hold together the various pieces of my material flat with the pattern, and then I just cut around it. Some people will, instead of pinning it down like that or even ironing out your piece, they will draw around the edge of the pattern piece on the back side of the fabric. And the reason that I don't do that is, again, I'm cutting out two pieces at once. So having the pins in place keeps the fabric from moving. And the material that I use is very slippery, and it has a little bit of stretch. So, and yes, you can absolutely ask questions in the chat. But so inevitably, when I'm getting pieces ready, so like both of these pieces, which are the sides of the lower jaw, I cut out two at a time. This piece, which is the inside of the nose, this I only cut out one per pattern, but inevitably, because there's less pieces that I have single pieces of, I cut out enough for two puppets when I'm cutting out my pieces. To show you what pieces I have, I keep all my puppet pattern pieces per item. So these are all the ones for the dragon puppets, in a bag. And so, to give you an example, these are those mouth plates I was talking about. So, you know, I label them upper jaw, lower jaw, mouth plate. Other things, for example, this set is all of my neck pieces. So, and these are all just hand drawn out. So I, you know, did a test pattern utilizing basically a bunch of muslin material, which I use on the inside of my puppets. So if you look here, there's this piece on the inside, which essentially holds all of my stuffing in place. And so for the back of the neck, it's a big triangle. And then there's a piece on the top of the head that then connects to where the triangle goes down the neck. And then there's the bottom of the jaw, which also is a little pocket of stuffing. And that does two things. So by having it be a pocket versus, again, like you would have on Kermit, where it's more utilizing foam primarily, it makes it so that it's a little bit less sticky inside the puppet, because 9 times out of 10, if you're performing with a puppet, your hand and arm are going to get really hot really quickly, just because you're moving around and doing various things. And so trying to minimize the damage to the puppet long term, I tend to find that just using a little bit of stuffing tends to just keep it lasting a bit longer. And the added benefit that I found, which I wasn't expecting, but I was definitely happy for, is that by basically reinforcing some of my seams by sewing the layer of muslin into what's colloquially the outside fabric is known as minky, but it's I use a brand of it's called Cuddle 3. The brand is Shannon, and they have a bunch of different colors. And like I said, it's a little bit stretchy. And by sewing in the muslin layer to the sections which again are the side of the face, the top of the head, the back of the neck, and the bottom jaw, it keeps that fabric from actually stretching anymore. So what on my big dragons ends up sort of foreshortening and looking a little bit squished, on the puppets look just like the pattern pieces, because I'm essentially, by sewing in each of these connection points to attach the pocket to the inside of the puppet, it keeps everything from stretching. And so I end up with these really long noses on these dragons that otherwise would, you know, look a little bit different. So again, this is going to be the side of the neck. These two pieces, of course, I'm connect like this, and that is inevitably the straight back of the neck. And then this piece here is the inside of the neck.
So in your process, how do you create your patterns? Do you just base off what you designed first when you made the comic, and then you try to figure out how to make it into a pattern?
So when I was designing them specifically to be puppets, I already had the overall structure that I had designed for the big dragons, and I basically upped it by 120%. So I took my hand-drawn patterns that I had for my big dragons, scanned them in, blew them up to 120%, and adjusted some of the pieces to make it just fit better by doing some test runs. Because inevitably in puppet making, there's kind of two overall methods to making patterns. One is to basically just base it off of something that already exists. So it's not uncommon for people to take pre-existing stuffed animals, for instance, cut them open, take out all the stuffing, and then say, add your mouth plate, you know, cut the mouth slightly so that, you know, there is something to either say pass a tongue through, or even just create your seam to where your upper and your lower jaw is going to be. Ironically, going back to Muppets, there aren't that many existing Muppet puppets that people can buy. So most of the stuff that people use to try and figure out, you know, sort of what the pattern process was in those, was taking some of the existing stuffed animals and then again back converting them into puppets. Sometimes it works, sometimes it's an absolute disaster, but you know, it's definitely something that's what people will do. For me, I was designing it initially for a stuffed animal first. And when I was going through and trying to design my pattern for Kermit, for instance, that was more completely from scratch, where I'm like, okay, let's see, you know, again, if it's got to be minimum to fit my hand, you know, what proportionality makes sense to, you know, sort of size what everything else fits down to. Now, for upsizing my pattern that I designed for my stuffed animals, the overall like patterning process partially was just, you know, I wanted the proportions to make sense for, you know, the head versus the arms, the overall body, the wings, the tail, everything else. And I basically drew it out as if it were a side view of the animal, for the body portion specifically. And, you know, just made everything else sort of fit in correlation with the way that that side view of that dragon looked. And when I was designing the puppets, the thing that didn't have any correlation with what had previously been designed was the neck. And so for that, I tried to keep it relatively simple in that it's essentially a triangle up top, you know, a flat area for the side of the neck, and then again, you know, a rectangle for the in the bottom of the neck. And you know, that's again partially going off of the way that I draw them. I know that certain sections of them are going to be different colors. In the case of Ember, I also worked in things like, you know, having this spot that I sew in, but you know, the overall pattern started with no details at all, just how does this thing fit together? And realistically, you're not going to end up with a perfect pattern piece when you're designing from stuffed animal to puppet. There's always going to be a little bit of changing it to make it work with what actually, ends up functioning well. So I had a couple different, like I said, I started with the muslin material and made a mock-up just to make sure that the thing, fit well, but also, was the correct proportion up. So whether it worked best as, say, 120%, which is what I ended up with, versus 130 down to, say, 115, all these different percentages of the pre-existing pattern. And there's no real perfect way to say this is going to be what I end up with beyond just using the material and trying it out. Another method that people will use when designing patterns is to design like a clay or even like crumpled newspaper version of whatever the object is. I'd be surprised if you guys didn't run into that in making cosplay shapes as well, where, essentially you're placing the fabric over the outside, or in some cases, instead of starting with the fabric right away, what people will do is take tape and cover the various material. Yeah, exactly. And you take an X-Acto knife and cut where you think your seams are going to be in that tape, and then lay that flat out on your freezer paper or whatever else you're designing your pattern pieces on. And that's essentially the flat version of whatever your 3D object is going to be. Because I started with the stuffed animal, I already had where my seams were going to be. So doing the shape like that didn't make sense for what I was doing. But I would say that if you have an idea of a 3D shape that you want to end up with, using the tape over method works great. And it certainly saves you a lot of time. I know some people that will go and try and design these things in 3D software. And I'm like, I bet you that takes longer than just building the thing out of tinfoil or paper, covering it with tape and cutting out your pieces that way. Because inevitably, you're taking something that, even if you're scaling it up yet again, you're starting with an object that's already the shape in the real world that you want. And then based on your knowledge of either other puppets or other stuffed animals, to say, this is where seams make sense. So, again, looking at these flat pieces, this is the inside of the mouth that, before it's connected to anything else. And this is the piece that inevitably becomes the pocket for the back of the neck. And then this is one of the pieces for the top of the head. That also gets connected to, because I have all these pinned together, this is for the side of the head. So there's two of those. And then again, the bottom portion of the lower jaw. So those lower jaw pieces then connect with the sides of the mouth for the lower jaw, but these don't have any stuffing in them at all. These connect to the lower jaw that does have where this stuffing sits. So, this attaches to this on both sides, but you want to sew this section first, so that, for one thing, again, you get that added rigidity. And if you can see, so that about an inch, apart from each other tends to be where I put in my pins before I put that through the sewing machine. And this section down at the bottom, that's going to be where I start my actual sewing process. So putting that right way up now. So from here, I go all the way around and then I end it on this little green pin here. What was that?
And that's to keep it from bunching, correct?
So that's so
the
for
pins
the pins
being about every inch or to keep it from bunching, correct?
Right. So, well, it's not really to keep it from bunching. It's depending on what it is. So because this is such a straight area, I tend to add less pins than I would say on a curved surface. But in general, the material is very, it's relatively stretchy. And so you want to keep it from, you know, moving in ways that you don't want it to move. So yes, there's a certain amount of bunching, but I would say more so than that, it's that you want the pieces to line up, because these are the exact same shape. And you don't want the sewing itself to be uneven so that you end up with a piece that then doesn't connect to the other piece as well. And so you're stopping it from bunching, but you're also just making sure that the pieces don't move when you're sewing them. And inevitably, when this is going through the machine, you're pulling out the pins right before you get to them. So I would say maybe a 1/4 inch before you hit the pin, you're pulling that out, and then just making sure that, you know, the machine isn't going to be having to have its needles replaced more often because it keeps hitting your pins. Some people will use clips instead of pins, but I tend to find that these little straight pins get in the way less and require significantly less effort to run them through a sewing machine. Part of that might be the fact that, you know, again, because I'm using relatively slippery material, it's, you know, and also relatively thick, it makes it so that if I'm combining more than, say, 2 pieces at a time, which obviously this is going to be 2 pieces, there's some instances where I have as many as 6 different pieces of fabric going at any given point in time together. And when that's happening, I want to make sure that it's as compact as physically possible. And that is, for me at least, I tend to find that having things held together with pins makes that easier. The one exception to that is this puppet here. She's the bane of my existence. And she has this lovely faux fur ruff. And when I'm attaching this faux fur to the rest of the fabric, I end up having to do basically a big whip stitch. So a whip stitch is the process of essentially going around in loops. So you sort of go around and then through all of the fabric together, and then you keep going around and pulling it tight each time. And the purpose of doing that in this case is it keeps all of this very fluffy, very large fabric a lot flatter so that I physically can run it through my sewing machine. And I do that once when I'm just basically combining 2 sides of the faux fur, and then a second time to the actual minky itself. And so that way, again, the goal is to pass it through the sewing machine once. If I didn't do that, the overall look of the seam between the 2 different fabrics, so if I were to leave it just with the hand basting and I didn't run it through the machine, there would be large enough gaps to where it would look very bubbly. And so I prefer the clean edge that the sewing machine gives me. And it also makes, again, the overall, you know, puppet last a heck of a lot longer. The unfortunate truth with a lot of puppet making is that puppets aren't necessarily made to last. So going back again to the subject of what type of material do you choose to use for a mouth plate, some people will literally use cardboard. And the problem with that is that if you're planning on, say, giving this to somebody to use, they might not know how to replace the cardboard if the time comes where that's what needs to happen. So I choose to use material that I know is going to survive years without changing, regardless of how much sweat and use and, you know, roughhousing is going to happen with that particular piece. And similarly with the seams, I want to make sure that if I'm using a small enough stitch on my sewing machine, that no amount of, you know, pulling on this is going to detach the faux fur from the rest of the puppet. In the case of literally every other puppet, I use basically a chain of, depending on this is the standard design, so it's literally just a bunch of triangles. But some of them are a more wavy design. It just depends on the particular character. But it's just a single piece of felt, so it's wool felt, and that just gets sewn through, and it takes significantly less effort to do that than it does, again, to use the faux fur. But the faux fur looks nice. It's a pain in the neck and it sheds everywhere, but it looks really nice. So when the occasion calls for it, that's what you have to do to make it work.
I know we've done a lot of work with fur, and it does get everywhere when you're working with it. But when the kids, I know, come to your booth and they see the dragons, especially, you know, our kid, he loves things soft and fuzzy, and he will play with them and snuggle up with them, which I'm sure a lot of kids do when they do get the dragons and they take them home.
Yes, yes. No, you want to make, and that's part of the reason that I use the Minky, even though it, again, while less of a pain in the neck than the faux fur, it's very soft and it's stretchy. So again, that's why I use so many pins. But it's worth it to me to have the vibrant colors and to have, bless you, the you know, range of options as far as partially the texture, because it comes in a couple different options. I tend to use just the solid flat ones, but they do make versions where it, say, has little bubbles, or it has you know, different other cut in designs. Like I've seen ones where it has like rose patterns and things like that that are cut into the actual pile of the fabric. And again, for me, I just use the flat, boring, you know, single color material, but gosh, it's such a nice material to use. I'm just trying to think of, as far as explaining some of the pieces. So this is my neck setup. So it makes a little bit more sense when you see it, you know, in multicolor versus just the flat pattern design. But so each of these pieces get sewn together, and then once this gets attached to the head, this section here is going to be where this is attached. And like with everything sewn, everything gets sewn inside out. So inevitably, I, you know, organize this in such a way to where the orientation is running the correct way, as if it's going to be facing outward, but I attach it to where there's a little bit of space at the bottom of the neck where the material doesn't go, and then this section up here attaches to the top of the head. But this section remains open until almost the very, very last step, to where, you know, I'm going through, because I want to make sure that this line is giving me access to changing certain things with the rest of the puppet, for one thing. So for instance, if I'm attaching the horn, which I do with a ladder stitch once the thing's already stuffed. So there's, for most of these things, the stuffing is the very last step. In the case of the horn, that gets stuffed pretty much as soon as it's sewn together. So it's two flat pieces like this. which if I turn this out the other way, little fluff bits going everywhere. So it's harder to see on the white, but tilting it a little bit, you can see where the seam line is, right? So on the bottom, I would say about half realistically, I've trimmed it to where almost all of the excess fabric next to the seam has been just trimmed away. And then on the top half, it's kind of hard to see. My cats are trying to get out of the room. To where it looks a little bit fuzzy, and that's because I've clipped. So anytime you have a curve when you're sewing, you want to essentially clip your edges so that there's these little tiny cuts in between. So like maybe like literally millimeters apart from each other. And you just keep doing that in the entirety of the section where there's going to be a curve. Now, the reason that this section is trimmed close to the edge is that also needs to be sewn into something else by hand. And so I don't want to have these big poofy edges when I'm sewing the edge of something into the other piece. So again, if you turn the thing the right way out, and this is where we get metal chopsticks. So that gets pushed to where, you know, the point of the horn goes all the way through to where it's as pointed as it can be. This is going to be stuffed with generally polyfill. I have two different types of stuffing that I use for my stuff. This is my non-polyfill stuffing, and I only use this for horns. This particular brand, I don't believe is for sale anymore, but what makes it different from polyfill is that it has 5% silk to the then 95% polyester. And whereas typical polyfill is going to be 100% polyester. And that 5% silk, what I've noticed is that if you look at the material, it looks a lot fluffier than your typical polyfill. And that's the difference that just these little tiny bits of silk give it. And ironically, it's able to become a lot more dense. So the actual horns will feel more like a horn because the material is a lot denser when I'm, you know, pushing the heck out of it into the actual, you know, horn. So what I'll typically do is I'll get, you know, little tiny pieces at a time and then just stuff those little tiny bits into the horn, and slowly as it goes, it will become more of a solid piece of material. Some people, in trying to accomplish the same thing, might say utilize like a hard plastic that maybe has like a rubberized edge around it or something. And then similar to like a plastic safety eye, you would have a stock that usually goes inside the material with a flat edge that, you know, essentially would also be accomplished by sewing this together once it's fully stuffed. And instead of using the ladder stitch to attach it the way that I use it, you know, on my own, you would essentially either have like a hook or an actual flat bracket that you would essentially just push it into place. So plastic safety eye, so they're cat eyes. The back portion of this is covered in paint, so that gives it the metallic sheen, but essentially it's just, you know, a flat piece there that goes into this little ridged piece of plastic. Can you see that pretty well?
Yeah.
So depending on how thick your fabric is determines how many of those little ridges, you need to essentially click past to connect it with this little piece that goes over the stock. Now, I'm not going to press that down because that will not come back off very easily, but you essentially push that down to as close to the bottom as you can, where the only thing that sits between, again, the flat back and the, you know, side of this piece of plastic that goes over the top is that fabric. So what I'll do, again, using, got this pile of stuff here. So if this were right side out, because again, this is essentially the same design as the puppets, I know that about here is going to be where the eye goes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in this case, this eye would go with this piece here. And this is currently wrong side out, so I'm turning it the correct way. So because this isn't completely sewn together, I'm not able to show the entire thing, but I know that this is the top of the eye ridge and the eye goes relatively here. So essentially I press down to make a little tiny, you can kind of see it with the direction of the fur. There's a little,
you make a indent,
you make
basically.
Exactly. And so then I'm going to take what's called an owl. So it's this little pointy guy, and essentially that stabs through the material where I make that mark to then open up enough of a hole to where that, you know, stalk can go through the material. So I can then, you know, again, if that's going all the way through, that attaches there. Does that make sense?
You would do that before? Yes, it does. So, and you would do that before you put the stuffing in?
Correct. Because once the stuffing's in, then that whole area is blocked off. So you really can't, you don't have access to the back of the material anymore. So you have to do that before you stuff it. And so, you know, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll get like a piece of tape and I'll cover the eye so that way something doesn't scratch it and, you know, make it look less shiny and nice. Because inevitably there's going to be pins and other things that could hypothetically scratch up that material. So if you cover it with blue painter's tape or, you know, whatever you want to use, that will make it so that, you know, the material itself doesn't get damaged. But, you know, that once all of the pieces themselves are sewn together, then that's when you attach the eye. Some people will use eyes that you literally just glue into place, but because I use the safety eyes, it has to be done when I still have access to the inside of the material. And again, when I'm, you know, one of the first things that I'm doing whenever I'm sewing these guys together because of the pockets is sewing that muslin layer to the back of the actual minky piece. And part of that is that, you know, it makes sense to have the seams be as close to the outside edge as possible. And it also makes it so that when I'm attaching it to the next piece, I'm kind of using that seam to determine where the next seam is going to end up. So to give you an idea, if I know that the lower jaw is going to be attached here, then if I'm already made a seam going all the way around and then I stop at this section here. So it leaves this top portion of the head unsewn. The reason for that is this piece of muslin attaches to this piece of muslin. So essentially, this connects here. These two pieces that are currently going in opposite directions will connect themselves. And then essentially those pieces will also connect. So does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense to me. I mean, anyone in the chat watching have any questions, please pop them in and we can answer them. Just throwing that out there. But I know it makes sense to me. I don't personally sew because I can't figure out the sewing machine to save my life, but I understand the concept.
So do you want to talk a little bit about sewing machines and just basic functionality there, or like what would be most helpful to you guys right now?
Babe, Jeff, what do you think?
Like I said, this I have a bunch of these different pieces.
Go through sewing machines. So.
Because it makes it easier to show you guys sort of different stages of it. But when I'm making one of these puppets, it typically takes like 8 to 12 hours, depending on, so, you know, this puppet takes the full 12 hours. Ember probably realistically takes more around 9. I'm gonna let my cat out real fast. She's yelling at me. 1 second.
Okay, no worries. I'm learning a lot about puppet making. I didn't know so much went into it.
All right, one cat down, one cat still in here.
It's a process.
Say that again? Sandra, I heard you saying that you didn't know that there was this many things that went into puppet making.
I mean, I knew there was stuff to it, but I didn't know like how much of the designing and cutting the pieces, because it's like, it also reminds me of like, we have a cosplay friend who makes their own dress patterns for their costumes because they don't find anything in their size, so they make their own. I'm like, it kind of falls along the same thing of making your own pattern and then getting your materials together and everything else. So it's like they do have some similarities there, which was like, that's interesting to me, because I was like, wow, I didn't realize that, because the only time I've made a puppet was literally a sock puppet for a class I was taking.
Yeah.
So I literally just took a sock and glued stuff onto it to make it look like something. So, and it was just really
and I mean, if you think about it, you know, again, a lot of the design to this is essentially mimicking what could start as a sock puppet, just made a lot more elaborate. And, you know, the neck, I have, again, this layer of stuffing that sort of sits on the top of your arm, and also inevitably on, you know, what is your hand, but is for the puppet, the head. And so that way it's sort of perched on top of you as you're using the puppet. So that when it's, you know, on your hand, it looks relatively normal. But then when it's just like this, it still retains enough of its shape that it doesn't look emaciated, if that makes sense. So real quick, I'm going to flip this thing inside out and kind of show you the inside bones of the puppet, as it were.
Ooh.
And see if this makes a little bit more sense from the standpoint of like how all of these pieces work together to make this whole unit. All right, so it's not fully pushed out yet, but so again, side of the neck, there's sort of a little trim line around the bottom. this is the pocket of stuffing that's shaped like a triangle.
Mm-hmm.
Under that is where this is attached, right?
Yeah.
And then this is the beginning of the head, but the reason I haven't fully pulled it out yet is this section here is where the tongue's attached, and then you have the upper and the lower mouth plate that is sewn together with a seam to keep both of those, you know, with basically a center point, so that your hand is essentially sandwiched around that portion there. So your thumb is going to be going in there, your upper hand, all your fingers are going up here, and that's all cushioned with a lovely layer of stuffing. So lower jaw, single bit of stuffing there. Again, that's your mouth plate, which goes, as you can see, right to the edge of the pink inside of the jaw.
Right.
And then this is the hardest part to push all the way through once the thing's made, is the actual, here. Like I was saying, my used and abused paintbrushes, as they were, I will also use to push these pieces back out, or frankly the other way as well. So when I'm done stuffing something, to turn it the right way around, I'm essentially doing this but in reverse.
Now, you were telling us off air before we got on, why do you use the paint brushes to do that, as opposed to just a normal stick or something?
So if you look at the size of the actual paintbrush in comparison to the puppet itself, and again, the other thing that I make are these big dragons. If I'm trying to deal with stuffing this tail, I better have something that's at least that long. Right?
Yeah.
This is the longest thin chopstick, and it's, I want to say this is 9 inches. Doesn't really do that much. So again, size difference between these two items here. That little bit of extra size is really nice, but the problem is this is made out of wood. I have snapped more of these, and this is not exactly a thin piece of wood, especially when you're talking about this section here, but right here they snap because of how much pressure I put on the thing to either do stuff like, you know, putting the thing the right way or the wrong way out. But I also have, these are the longest, I want to say these are like 16 inches or so. These are cooking, like you would use in, say, like a Chinese restaurant. So if you're using a wok and you want a nice long chopstick so that you don't burn yourself, typically, again, they're going to be using wooden, but if you want to use metal, these exist. Point-wise, even though it doesn't look too terribly different, this has a much bigger end than this one does. And, you know, again, it's just about, you know, a little bit less than double the length of the smaller one. And if I'm, say, stuffing something that's rather small, like, say, the tip of the nose, then I want to have as small of a, you know, piece as I can possibly manage. But for 90% of the stuffing, I'm using this. And part of that is, this is going to be, as you can see, it's very fluffy. This, which is what I was showing you guys earlier. So these are the same thing. This is one that hasn't been used for stuffing. This is one that's been used for stuffing a lot. And so essentially, these just get pushed like this through whatever section that I'm, you know, stuffing the item. And so I very much have, you know, some items that are actually used for paint, and then I have the tools that are used for stuffing. Never these two shall meet. And you know, I've done quite a bit of searching to try and find, you know, say like a crimper to essentially combine these two together, because this would be, if I could have this with that on the end of it, it would be the perfect tool for stuffing. At least I would still have this without it, but you know, combining these would get rid of the inevitable problem that exists with these paintbrushes, which is they snap. That would never happen with this because it's made out of aluminum. But it's one of those things where, you know, you use the best material and the best tools that you can get within reason. And the combination of these three things is what I use for stuffing. And you know, that's what I've found.
Have you ever tried a drumstick?
I mean, you could. The problem with the drumstick would be that the end of the drumstick, the tip is probably too big for the small detailed stuffing stuff that I'd be doing. So for example, if I'm stuffing this hand, I want precision. And the drumstick also has the same problem of, typically they're, you know, gonna be about the smaller length, chopstick length, maybe a little bit longer. I think most drum sticks are about a foot long. Don't quote me on that, but I want to say that that's about right. Whereas I don't think that they make many that are more this size. I'm sure they exist, but it's, you know, most of them are wooden. So you get into the same problem of, you know, the snapping that you'd be having with these. Now, granted, they might not be as brittle, just due to the fact that typically, I would imagine that most drumsticks are going to be made by carving an actual stick versus, say, taking a piece of plywood and, you know, making what I can only imagine these come from. But, you know, so you're probably starting from a piece of wood that isn't going to snap as easily, but you put proper pressure behind any piece of wood and eventually even the hardest woods will snap. And that, for me, is my one problem that I run into with these wooden paintbrushes. But the fact that this has a fluffy end to push the actual polyfill into the cavities of the stuffing area that I want stuffed, is why I continue to use these, even though I have, you know, multiple length chopsticks, which work very well. But I was, before we went live, I was telling a horror story that I was using one of the metal chopsticks, which, even though it has a blunted end, it's still, you know, a very hard material. And I punctured through one of the fingers in one of my big dragons and had to then repair that, because I'd put enough work at that point. I didn't want to start over with a new set of hands. And that would not have happened if I was stuffing it with a paintbrush, because the fluffy bits on the end of the paintbrush physically cannot push through with the same force and rigidity that you get with the metal chopstick. So again, combining these two together would be great, but sometimes, even though you have to be aware of how much pressure you're putting behind the polyfill, sometimes this is what you want. So it's just a matter of, again, depending on how much space is, you know, on either side of either the chopstick or the paintbrush, you know, will determine which does the job better. So for example, if I'm, you know, adding a handful of stuffing into a large area frankly, at that point, I'm not even going to look at the chopstick. I'm just going to use the paintbrush, and I'm going to be just, putting in big pieces at a time. But so like pretty much this entire section, when I'm stuffing that, I never touch the chopstick. I'm always using the paintbrush because this is more than sufficient. Does that make sense? But and again, I'm going to try and fully reverse this. This is the most annoying. This never normally happens. So you have to, work at pushing this through the other direction.
Have you ever had to flip them back inside out after you've made them before?
Absolutely. I mean, other than showing the seams, there's really no reason for it. So that's the thing, is that, everything that I've done by the point that I'm turning the puppet right side out. So, the reason that I'd want to have access to the rest of this has already taken place. So unless you're repairing something, so say if, any of these seams had a rip for whatever reason, then at that point, yeah, you're going to want to have access to that section of the puppet again. But otherwise, everything that needed to be sewn or needed to be attached in the case of the eyes or the, nose horn, things like that, has already been taken care of. So essentially, when the last couple steps when I'm making a puppet, one is, again, before the thing gets stuffed, is to sew this seam at the bottom of the neck, at which point I attach my little tag. But if you're making your own, that may or may not matter. But it's, making the bottom of the puppet seam finished. So it's essentially just folded over, and then you just get as reasonably close to the edge as you can when you're sewing. Typically, most seam allowances tend to be at about 1/4 inch. I know for a fact that I do some of my seam allowances even 2/3 smaller than that. So I'll have, a space from the edge of the fabric to where the line of stitches happen take less than 1/8 of an inch of space. Mostly that's just, I can, so I might as well give myself extra material. But one thing that I've had some people use these for, that I found was kind of funny, was to utilize the puppets as golf club covers. And so if I wanted to put a elastic on the bottom of the neck so that you can then cinch that tight and have it so that it doesn't fall off your golf club, you have to have enough space on that seam. So again, that space there, to where you can actually push through a piece of elastic. But it's like a hem on a shirt. You're literally just finishing off that section of the sewing. And then the last step before you turn the thing right side out is to basically run this section from one side of the head to the other, which attaches the stuffing part on the neck with the top of the head, which again is 4 pieces of muslin. So you got the one big triangle piece here, you got the 2 sides of the face, and then you got the top. And so if you can see, this seam is essentially, each of those pieces connecting to each other up to this point. So there's kind of this little cross guard here that is just bunched up because of the way that the stuffing inevitably sits inside of there. So there's stuffing all the way through here that then goes to the top of the nose. There's stuffing here, and you kind of get that little seam over here, but it's literally just the way the stuffing sits. Same deal on the other side. And then instead of attaching to the fabric of the outside, it's attached here. This was left open because that gets hand stitched into place, but the top and the 2 sides get sewn together. So essentially this section is connected muslin to muslin to muslin. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. And then again, this, you leave this section open, and then as you're stuffing it, you basically make it so that there's, you know, just enough to be poofy. And then you use a ladder stitch to go to the side, and that essentially takes you to the top of the beginning of this seam here where the triangle portion starts, and the top of the side of the head. And then this portion of the top of the head you stitch to the neck piece, and then same thing as the other side on the other side of the side. Now this section here is super easy. So again, everything's sewn to the fabric with the exception of this little pocket space up here. And once that's stuffed, then you just, again, ladder stitch it to itself. So same idea as the top, but it's just essentially attaching to the seam allowance from where the neck attaches to the rest of the head. So that way on the outside of the puppet, you're not actually seeing those stitches at all. So that is only visible from the inside of the puppet. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's why you can see it's just clean connection pieces on the outside. So for anyone who didn't know that, that's why. And that's what it looks like on the inside.
Yes. Again, looking at the mouth plate. So, you know, those were fused into place. And then essentially I cut open the pink portion where those two sides met, pushed the tongue through, and sewed a line straight through both the top and the jaw mouth plate. And so we're gonna push this thing right side out again.
Now, you said they take anywhere between 8 to 12 hours depending on the puppet. How long did that particular one take you?
This one? Realistically, she probably took closer to 9. So what takes the longest on Ember, so again, comparing these two, there's at least an hour just doing that hand basting or the whip stitch to get this into place. Part of that is, again, we're dealing with very floofy and very slippery fabrics. And so I want to make sure that I'm getting these stitches as close and as tight together as physically possible so that I can squash the fabrics as flat as they can physically be. And I'm doing that twice. So, you know, I'm pinning everything into place. Then I'm doing the whip stitch. Then I'm pinning all the pieces again. And then I'm whip stitching. And so at each step of that process, things are moving around despite all of my best pinning efforts. And I'm just, you know, sort of working with the process as well as I can without going insane. And, you know, it's the fact that when that final stitch pass with the machine is finished, that it looks so gosh darn nice. That is the only reason that I tolerate that process at all. Whereas again, having, you know, the felt version of essentially the same, you know, frill, whether it be the faux fur or the felt, you know, this on this puppet takes maybe 10 minutes at most. Like realistically, I could probably get that done in 5 if I'm really going fast on the sewing machine. But you know, that's a big difference between one and the other. What probably takes the longest on this, and why I'd say it's a little bit longer than say the quickest puppet, is each of these spots, both on the top of her head and on the neck, are sewn in as opposed to applique. Part of that is I want it to be very seamless, and so that inevitably isn't like a layer of extra fabric on top, which is what you would do with applique. And so I basically just reinforce those seams, again, to make it so that the thing's more durable. But this is the sort of section that if ever there was going to be a popped seam, it would be here. Simply because it's, you know, an area that is curved as opposed to a lot of these other lines are straight, and thus they, you know, have less pushing against each of those, you know, individual seams. The very last step, though, is putting on these eyelids. So I have a little baggie that I contain all of my eyelids for all the different puppets, and I just have them pinned together in sets. And essentially they are little half circles. They're not quite complete half circles, but
more or less a half circle.
More or less a half circle. So this is the shape of one of the eyes for the eyelids. Mm-hmm. And I make sure that, you know, when I'm, again, sort of designing that pattern, that if I were to lay it on top of there, it's a little bit wider than the actual size of the eye itself. In this case, I know that each of these eyes are 30 millimeters in diameter. I can't say that I've ever actually measured one of these because I literally designed them by just, you know, trial and error, frankly. And you know, I essentially keep one extra pair of eyelids past whatever I know that I need based on how many I have cut out at any given point in time, so that I can use that extra to be the template for the eyelids that come down the line. So this is the only piece that technically I don't have a piece of paper version of the pattern, which is probably stupid of me, but this is the pattern piece.
It works for you. Some people are just like, I can eyeball this. I just know. Just like when you're cooking and you just like know, oh, that about that much of seasoning is good. That looks good. That's about right.
Well, and again, it's not a huge, like any other piece. I have to make sure that, you know, when I'm laying out all my pattern pieces on any one type of fabric, you know, I want to make it as space efficient as possible so that I don't have a lot of extra, you know, pieces that are getting thrown away. So over here, I have my little trash can that inevitably is filled with lots of individual fabric scraps, as well as a bunch of thread that has been cut. So just to give you a general idea, you know, this is the most current handful of stuff. And
it looks like our trash cans.
Yeah, no, so it's, you know, little stuff like this. You know, this is some of the felt. You know, it's just little slivers of nonsense that ends up accumulating. But if I have pieces that are, you know, big enough to contain any of the other, you know, sections of the puppet, or in the case of the stuffed animal, one of those pieces, then I feel like I've wasted what is a relatively expensive piece of material. So I have bags of literally scrap pieces that I'm like, I might be able to fit something in there one day. Now, whether or not that's actually ever going to happen is up for debate. But, you know, if I can, I will use those, you know, pre-cut sections of extra fabric before I go into my literal bolts of fabric, if I can manage it. So this is one of those bags. So it's got, a couple different types of material, both minky, but my Shandira plush, which is my purple dragon, this is the extra bag of her pieces, or what was almost a piece, I suppose is the more correct way to say that. So those are my Shandira scraps.
Yeah, but a decent enough piece where it's worth keeping.
Yeah, but
that's what that basket Jeff has over there.
To have enough space for an eyelid. Like, these are so small that I will, if I don't have enough space left to fit in a couple eyelids, then something else is wrong. I've been, far too efficient in my, Rubik's Cube of space allocation that, I have other better things to worry about, frankly. And, so long as I always have pieces, because like everything else, I use one pin in the case of these, because of how tiny they are, to the actual material to then cut around the edge of it to then make a duplicate. And so far, unless I happen to lose everything, so if this bag were to get lost and I'd have to start from scratch, then at that point I would have to come up with a new way to, recreate my pattern piece for the eyelids. But knock on wood, that's never been a problem. And I can't think of a reason why this would ever completely get lost. But, worst case scenario, I know generally what I'd be recreating. Or I suppose worst case scenario, I could just take one of them off of one of the finished puppets and do that. But essentially when I'm sewing on the eyelids, I start at this side and I take, show you, this is my little nest of needles. So I prefer, when I'm sewing, to use these curved needles. And I want to say that these are like 1.25 inches as far as from, the pointed end to the side where you're actually attaching your thread. And I use thread that's generally referred to as heavy duty thread, but it is this particular brand. It's Gutermann Mara, and it's the size 30. It's 100% polyester, but this stuff is sturdy enough that regardless, I don't have to worry about the thread snapping on me. So if I were to use the same type of thread that I use in my sewing machine for my hand stitching, regardless of whether it's a cotton thread or a polyester thread or any of that, your typical machine sewing thread is way too thin. And even if you double up on it, which I have tried before, and in the cases of, say, a repair, if I'm, like what I was discussing earlier, punching through fabric and I'm trying to repair a hole like that, in that case, I'm using the same type of thread that I'd use on the machine. But for all my hand stitching stuff, I use, this much thicker thread, which is essentially like embroidery floss, but it's not as shiny. And the reason for this is I can get much smaller stitches with this style of, it's an upholstery needle, than I would if I were to have used one of my straight needles. Now, I do also have, just because 9 times out of 10, if you're getting a set of needles that have these upholstery needles, these are the 2 different sizes that you're going to get. So this is the big size that, is closer to 2 inches, and then this is the smaller size that's closer to 1 inch. I use the smaller one. But, depending on your dexterity with a needle and trust of, what you're working with, you might prefer one to the other. But, this is the only type of needle that I use anymore when it comes to hand stitching. And typically, I'm just going to cut a quick piece of thread here. When I'm sewing the eyelids, I am going to pre-knot my thread with a triple knot. So I'm essentially just going to do your standard knot. That's going to be what it looks like with a single knot. And then I'm just going to tie it 2 more times. Mm-hmm. So it's a triple knot. And I found that is the correct size of a knot to where it stays on the correct side of the material. Single or double knot, it's going to pass through the holes in the Minky and it's just going to make a hole. The triple knot is big enough that it will not pass through the fabric. And situate itself and stay where it's supposed to be. Now, the other thing that I do specifically with eyelids, so at no other hand sewing stage for the rest of the puppet will this come into play, but that little tiny tail on the end there, I will take my little snips and I will cut it to where, yes, there's still technically a tail, but it is a very, very, very short tail, and it will not show up when I'm essentially going through the actual eyelid portion. Where did those eyelids end up getting put? I'm sorry, my table is a mess and I've lost my eyelids. I think I maybe put them back in the bag. This is my little nest for my plush eyelids. So I'm just going to pull those out real fast. They are, again, just a little bit smaller than the ones I use for the puppets. But for the purpose of what we're talking about right now, it's going to be the same conversation. So this needle, at this point, will go through the corner like so. Mm-hmm. And then the inside of the knot is sitting right there on the inside of the fabric. So again, right side of the fabric, wrong side of the fabric. So it sits on the wrong side. And then what a ladder stitch is where you essentially go up one side of the material and then the reverse side, and you just chain from one side to the other. So trying to think, what material can I do this on without destroying anything that I currently have on my table? All right, so I'm going to just use, even though these are 2 different purples, we're just going to use them to kind of give you a general example. So, well, yeah, that'll work fine. So again, to do a ladder stitch, you start on the right side of the material. You've already connected your end, and you go in the fabric. You do a tiny little, so if you see, it's just a little tiny bit that the needle is going through. It's a very short distance. Mm-hmm. And then you pull that through, and you essentially do the exact same type of stitch on the other side, but on the eyelid portion itself. And what you would do is do that same chain starting from the side that's on the back of the head, maybe I'd say 2/3 of the way down the eye, or a third of the way up from the bottom corner of the eye, and you go up and around the eye itself. And what that essentially gives you is this little flap that sits over the top of the eye. But when I'm pretty much doing a ladder stitch as close to the actual safety eye as I can until I get to where the top of the eye starts curving. And then to make it look a little bit more realistic and also to keep it from covering up too much of the eye, I'll have my path of stitches go maybe at most a 1/4 inch, but sometimes, somewhere between a 1/8 of an inch and a 1/4 of an inch, doing a little, again, semicircle above and then tapering back down to, once it gets to the side of the eye again, to as much space as I have left until I tie it off on the other side. So essentially, it's as close as I can get, up a tiny little bit, over a little bit, still above, and then down and hugging the side and tying it off. And when I'm tying off the other side, again, I want to triple knot it and then cut it as close as I possibly can get so that piece of thread isn't just hanging out looking ridiculous outside of the eyelid. Sometimes you can kind of push the thread underneath the safety eye. But realistically, if your safety eye is tight enough the way that it's supposed to be to keep it from moving, then you're kind of more tucking it between the safety eye and under the eyelid if there's enough space. But yeah, that's kind of the final step is putting on those eyelids so that it keeps the eyes from looking super bulgy and ridiculous. Unfortunately, I don't have any of, or actually, no, I do. For Ember here, she has not been stuffed. So her eyes are currently without eyelids.
Yeah, it's very much like, hi, how are ya?
Yeah. So they just look a bit calmer with that added upper eyelid. But I never do that step, partially because it ends up looking better once the thing is stuffed. But it's especially the case on the big plushes that, because this material is so stretchy, I want to make sure that it's the material itself is kind of shaped to the correct, orientation before I add the eyelid. So once the head is stuffed on her, that's when she gets her eyelids added. But because, the stuffing is the step right before I turn these right side out, that's why the very last step is adding that eyelid. Because I've not seen the outside of the puppet until I turn it right side out, and I'm not going to turn it right side out until the interior stuffing has been sewn into place. Which again was by combining the various pieces of the muslin together. So yeah, that is the basics of what it goes into making one of these. Do you guys have any questions?
For those watching live or later on, when you have them at your booth, how much do you sell them for?
That's a good question. So, for any of these type of things, I just want to go out on a tangent kind of and say that I do not price them by the hour. And part of that is that the amount that I would have to charge if I were to do that would make it so that I would never sell a puppet. So currently at shows, they are $75 a piece. And that's mostly taking the material cost and timesing it by 3. So the actual hours that it takes to make one of these things is not calculated into that price. But I will say that when I'm selling them on my website, for example, or also when I was attaching them to, say, a Kickstarter campaign, if I'm raising money to print my comic books, I will charge $125 per puppet. So, basically the reason that I have those 2 different price points is when I'm in person, it makes me happy to see somebody excited about my puppets, so I let them go for a little bit less. But if they're ordering them on the website and I don't get to have that fun interaction, then you're going to be paying a little bit more. So personally, that's how I justify that to myself. For the big ones, so again, they're not puppets, they're stuffed animals. They generally are, $300. And that's just because it takes more material, and inevitably it also takes more time to make them as well. And same deal where in person, they're a little bit less. On the website, they're a little bit more. But I also, for both the puppets and for the stuffed animal dragons, I do give people the option, if they want, to customize their own of either. And those start at either 125 or at 300. So the details that you would pick to make your own, perfect version of my style of dragon will be based off of, the online price plus whatever details you pick. So for example, Ember has 3 different non-mouth, because I just don't count those in there because it's such a small amount of fabric, primary colors. So she's got, the inside of her neck, she's got the accented darker green, and then she has the lighter green for the rest of her, for her primary color. Same color breakdown for Ruby here. So she's got, the dark red, she's got, again, that yellow, and then she's got the pink. This lovely puppet, who is a ton of fun to make because she's got these sort of dog ears. If you notice, she doesn't have an actual frill like the other ones do. And she doesn't have any horns or anything. She's the one that takes 8 hours. If anything, I might be able to get her done in 7. But, she is by far the simplest of all the puppets that I have. And she's the exact same price as the one that takes the longest. And the reason that I did that is, I don't want people to pick which puppet they want based on, is that one a little bit more expensive than the other one? I just want them to pick their favorite. So for me, it's a rolling average, realistically. So it's, yes, Ruby probably should be an extra $50, if not more than that, because she takes so much time. And, Gemini there, the yellow puppet, should be significantly less than the others. But as far as just pricing them the same across the board, I do that so that people are not making a monetary decision on which puppet they want to get. They're choosing who their favorite character is. And it's worth it to keep it that way for me, as opposed to having to remember this is the scale of price points. Whether that's the correct business decision to make or not is, for other people to determine when they're pricing their own puppets. I would say that I'm definitely in the minority of people that kind of, I have a set of standard puppets that I always try and keep in stock. There's a dozen of them, and they're just all my different dragon characters. But say, for example, if all I was doing was custom work, then in that case, they're all individually priced. And that's going to be based off of, how much time it takes to design the pattern, how long it took to make the thing, and how much the material cost. But because these are my standard designs that are already done, Essentially, it's just, okay, let's make a replacement of whichever of the 12 characters it is. And because of that, you know, I'm not putting a price in place based off of how long it took me to design, because at this point, that's so well far beyond what I'm worrying about anymore that it's literally just, okay, did I have to buy new material? This is what you're paying for, essentially. So if you're doing what I'm doing, where it's you have a set of characters that you design and make on a regular basis, then it makes more sense to have a standard price. If you are just doing customs and each client is essentially asking for you to design a puppet from scratch, and they are telling you what the character is and the type of details that they want into that specific puppet, then that sort of pricing model is going to be a lot more individualized, because it has to be, you know, to be able to say, okay, you know, I'm going to be saying any custom puppet is going to be whatever price, like say it's $250. That might be the average, depending on the level of detail and the type of materials that you tend to use. But what I tend to find happens is that I'm ordering custom colors. I'm, you know, sometimes ordering material that I don't typically use in my own designs. And so what price I can get those individual materials will be very variable depending upon when I happen to be making those orders. And then, you know, depending on if it's a material that I've not had experience with before, or even I had a customer who wanted me to incorporate a zipper into the design for something. And so, you know, things like that, where sometimes you just don't necessarily know what is actually going to be going into any particular project. And so what I tend to do for customs is I'll guess and I'll say, okay, this is what you're going to have as a retainer fee for me to gather the materials, start designing it, and then based off of what I actually used and the time that went into making the actual thing, that's when I finalize the actual total price. And because there's just so much variability when it's just make a puppet, as opposed to if I'm saying, here's my base pattern and you get to pick what the details are. That's a lot easier because I have all the control and I know what it takes to do each individual change. But if you're starting completely from scratch, do not say, okay, whatever you want me to do, it's going to be, you know, X amount of money. You know, I don't care if you say, oh, it's each one's $1,000. Sometimes you're going to have a project that comes in where you do not expect what your client wants, and you don't want to be in that position. So you want to keep track of, here's all the things that I got, here's the material that I actually used, and, you know, this is the amount of time that it took me to do the thing. But, you know, it's because of that there's going to be a huge, you know, variability on what it could cost. But I would say, you know, most custom puppets, in my experience, again, the average tends to be around like the $250 mark when you're dealing with materials. But it just depends. Do you have any other questions, Sandra?
On your standard puppets, about how much fabric do they take?
So I did actually get this figured out at some point. I want to say that I can fit so if I'm dealing with, again, all of the material folded in half and I'm cutting out the two pieces at once, typically for one color I'm using about a little more than a quarter of a yard. So it's for the height of the material. Let's see. Yeah, so it's about 13 inches in height, and then all the way across, which is going to be, I forget what the width typically is. Let me measure it. 1 second.
Like 56 or something like that.
Yeah, I forget if it's. Yeah, so it's about like 13 by 30 inches. And then I fit all the, for the primary color. And then it's a little, I'd say about a third of that for the secondary pieces. So that's going to be, again, the inside of the neck, the inside of the ears, the inside of the nose. And then 2 plastic safety eyes per. I was going to show you guys, I have, so these are kind of my, for the, felt pieces, almost every bit is based off of this size. So it's going to be, 18 inches in length and then about 3 inches. Yeah. So 3 inches wide. And then one of these, when I'm cutting them, typically gets me 2 pieces. So again, almost everything that I'm cutting will be to make 2 puppets. So if I can get, 2 sides of the same, that just means I'm wasting less material. A couple of my designs though, so like this design here for one of the pieces, it's 2 pieces that I sew together, and I essentially create, I'll show you a different one, but it's the same idea. This is for one of the big plushes, but the edge of it is sewn all the way around. And then I turn it right side out. I'll sew it starting from this end all the way along the edge up to here, and then along the edge of the first section. Then I'll sew it from here to here, and then on the third bit here. So for this, same idea. I'll sew it from here all the way to the end, flip it right side out. I'll sew it from here to here. I'll sew this top section. I'll sew this section here, and then down to the next, down to the next, down to the next. And so it essentially creates these little flat pockets, but it creates a rigidity that gets me the shape that I want without having the edges themselves be, I guess, a little bit too bulbous. So
softened.
Yeah. Well, so similarly on my, I guess this is one detail I never talked about. So on the actual mouth of the puppet, there's a tiny little ridge all the way around on both the top and the bottom jaw that is essentially as small of a seam allowance as I can possibly do all the way around the edge. And essentially when I'm doing this, it's a similar thing, but it's a bigger amount of space by maybe double. And so it's essentially just keeping it as flat as I can possibly make the thing. For what, in the design that I'm trying to show is essentially a really like a frill on like a lizard or something, where it's this, or a, why am I forgetting my dinosaurs? It, you know, sort of like a triceratops, how they have, you know, the flap on the back of their head, or like a veiled chameleon, same deal, where you have this, you know, flat piece, but it has rigidity to it. That's essentially what I'm trying to accomplish with having this dual layered piece that then is sewed together and sectioned off. It's same concept. Whereas when it's a single piece like this, you know, it's designed to be floppy, and so it can just be cut once and worried about never. So yeah. I don't know if I overcomplicated that or if that made just enough sense, but it's essentially, depending on the character, there's 3 type of ridges. Number 1, single piece of felt. Number 2, 2 pieces of felt sewn together. Number 3, the bane of my existence, is Ruby and her faux fur.
Is Ruby why you only have one dragon with the faux fur?
I mean, it technically isn't. It's more just none of the other characters did I design to have fluffy bits like that. And she literally just has, you know, almost like feathery fluff, you know, from the top of her head all the way down to her tail. And so that has always, like, when I was fabric shopping for her, I'm like, can I get a 5-inch pile instead of 3? And unfortunately, within the amount of money that I was willing to spend for the colors that I was trying to get, 3-inch was what was available. But goodness, if I could get a 5-inch pile, I would love to do that. It would look so much better. But I don't think it would be the same amount of difficulty as far as sewing. I don't think the added length would change anything. As far as difficulty is concerned, it's more just, as I'm sure you're aware, most faux fur has very stiff, very thick backing. And so the, you know, difficulty in trying to squish all of that material together has nothing to do with the fact that it's fur. It has everything to do with the fact that the backing material is so thick. And so if the backing material on the faux fur was more similar to the minky material, it would maybe take a little bit of less work to do it. But it's just the fact that it's this big, stiff, ridiculous thing. It looks great. She's lovely, but she is a pain in the neck to make. I'll tell you that for nothing. So,
yeah, like I said, we can relate because we have made furry things too, and it's been for days, weeks afterwards. It's floating around the cosplay room, lingers into the rest of the house too. Sometimes it's on us as we're going to work or to school, and we're like, what the heck? This project is following us everywhere.
Well, so I have, I don't even know what these are technically for. It's called a micro brush, bendable applicators. So it's basically just got a little fluffy bit on the end that I use to clean out my sewing machine. Usually after, I would say, 3 puppets worth of sewing, or every one of my big dragons. And it's the inside of the machine underneath the bobbin plate is just covered in fluffy material that's essentially here, because there's some of it just sitting on my table here. See if you can see this. So just tiny little fluffies. So that's what comes out of Minky.
I see it.
It's just little tiny fluffy bits. And that's just condensed into all of the places that they can manage to be inside of that machine. And so I tend to find that that is the most effective way to get them out. But otherwise, this little machine, it's a Brother SE400. So it can do both embroidery and sewing. But I've had this little guy for, I think 12 years now, 12, 13 years. And I've only ever had to take it in to get it repaired, I think 3 times in its life. And considering, you know, the amount of sewing that I put this little guy through, I'd say that's pretty darn good. And realistically, the only thing that causes it to need repair is the timing belt tends to get off sometimes. And so they need to basically recalibrate everything so that it's running efficiently, because it starts, when I take my sewing machine in, it starts making stupid noises to where, you know, there's the normal running sound that the sewing machine has, which is partially why I'm showing you pieces as opposed to actually showing you, you know, the workings of the machine, because it can be a little loud and annoying. But, you know, when it starts making big chunk noises that it shouldn't be, or the machine binds itself up and refuses to sew at all, that's when I'm like, all right, it's time to bring you in to get a little bit of servicing. And that's usually under $200 to get that taken care of. So, you know, I know that some people, especially for puppets, making them, and again, especially if you're working with material like this, where it's more of a nylon material, where there's so many more fluffy bits that you can kind of hide your stitches with, as opposed to the minky that's so smooth that you can see every single line of stitching. Like it physically doesn't work like this when it comes to trying to hide things. And so because of that, I want everything to be as clean and even as physically possible. But if you were to try and hand stitch everything, again, the 2 different stitches that you want to utilize are your whip stitch, which is, you know, going around like this, or your ladder stitch, which is to, you know, go on either side of the material in a big chain. And that's the one where if you pull it at the end after a couple inches, that's where it very nicely pulls everything together in that Henson stitch style. So yeah, I hope that was helpful.
I feel like it was. There's a lot I didn't know about sewing and making puppets. I knew like little things that made sense about the allowances when you're sewing things together, but just the puppets in general, I didn't really know.
Yeah, one thing that, again, to sort of harken home the idea of how close you want your pins to be together sometimes. So this is, again, the big stuffed animal, but same material. That is about maybe a 1/4 inch apart from each other. And then when it gets into the more straight area, again, that's closer to maybe 3/4 of an inch apart from each other. So it just depends, you know, if you're dealing with a curved space, like on the elbow there, or if you're dealing with the straight areas, such as just going down each finger, where you want to determine, sorry, my husband is texting me, to see, you know, how close you want any pin to be from the next. And again, the point is you want to keep the material from moving as much as physically possible. You also, with this material, want to run your sewing machine a little bit slower than if you're, say, sewing a pillowcase, for example. So I have mine set from the speed. So you got the slowest, the medium, and the fastest, and you can have it at any point on that. I tend to just keep mine just past the middle so that it's still sewing pretty quickly. But, you know, if I'm turning a corner, I don't want to have to worry about, you know, did I because again, we're dealing with such small seam allowances here. You don't want to overstep your seam allowance and all of a sudden you're past the material altogether when you're turning that corner, especially when you're dealing with something as small as, say, you know, any individual horn or, you know, the end of a nose or something like that, where it's, you know, as opposed to if it's a big long section, like when I'm sewing these neck pieces for the big long lines, I don't have to think about that. That's just, I can run it at full speed. It doesn't matter. But anytime that you're dealing with details, don't feel bad. Slow your machine down a little bit and just take it a little bit slower. And, you know, so long as you have enough pins, which I think I probably at this point have like 500 pins that I just keep in this little duct tape nest because it works. I basically have my little pin cushion. It fits perfectly inside the duct tape. And this is my nest for all my pins. It doesn't have to be fancy if it works. But, you know, I tend to find that, you know, if I'm dealing with, I think a standard set of straight pins you can get for like 250 in a multicolored set. I have 2 of those, so again, around 500 pins, and that tends to do me pretty well when it comes to covering the amount that I need for any project. Or in the case of the puppets, usually I can do about up to 4 with the amount of pins that I have. But that's because for me, when I'm working on any of these projects, typically I want to have it go seamlessly from one thing to the next. And again, if I know that about every 3 puppets is when I'm cleaning my machine, having 3 puppets lined up to then run, to me, makes a lot of sense. But again, those are the types of things where, depending on what your project is, having those types of things designed to work in tandem with each other makes, you know, more or less sense. Whereas if you're doing constant custom jobs, then, you know, it's you just do one and then on to the next and don't necessarily worry about flow as much as I am when I'm trying to keep up with having a dozen puppets all in stock for my various shows. So different goals for different people.
All right.
So would you like to tell us a little bit about your books?
Sure. Here, let me grab one of them so I can give you guys a visual aid. So this is my comic Dragon Child. This particular one has 6 issues in it. So this purple dragon on the cover here is what this piece will turn into eventually. So that frill on the top there, that's that purple piece that I was showing you earlier. This guy. But so it is, just trying to find a fun place here. So it is a black and white comic, and basically it's a modern day fantasy where mythical creatures are real, and the dragons pick one human to represent all of those different creatures to all of us in the modern day, and so that is their dragon child. When I started designing the big plush toys and then eventually the puppets, the idea was to have something on the table to draw people into the comic. And I'm always very pleasantly surprised when people see the comic before they see the dragons. If you look up any of my social media or my website, dragonchild.net, you'll see a big tree full of dragons that have typically both my plushes and the puppets. And that's designed so that, you know, they're a good 6 to 7 feet off of the ground that you can see from, across the room, as opposed to, the couple of feet off the table that my little book stands tend to show off the books for. But I both write and draw the comic, as well as make all the plushes and puppets. So I'm constantly busy with something, hence my workroom, having all this stuff just strewn around in it. But it's the reason that it's a black and white comic is because the style of comics that I grew up reading were also in black and white. And specifically, the comic that got me into comics was Jeff Smith's Bone. And that currently is now also being published through Scholastic, and it's available in full color. But the one that I grew up reading was when he was still doing it in black and white. And so when I was designing my own story, I wanted to do something in that vein of what I saw as a very comforting, take to my own childhood with black and white comics. And so it's an ongoing series. Currently, I have 9 issues out. I just had a successful Kickstarter that combined each set of 3 issues, so 1 through 3, 4 through 6, and then 7 through 9 into 3 separate books that I'm calling mini volumes. So this guy here is a full 6 issues, so this is a normal volume of comics. And so if you split that in half, and then the next set of 3 after that, you got the 3 volumes that I just published. And that is, I would say becoming more and more common in comics nowadays to combine things in sets of 3 or 4 as opposed to, waiting for the full 6 just because comics take a long time to make. But it's tons of fun. And for me, I always enjoyed telling stories, and I've always enjoyed drawing. And then, as a kid that clearly was a Jim Henson fan, I, teaching myself how to make my puppets and my stuffed animals was not a very far stretch for me to, actively seek out the best ways for me to learn how to do all this kind of stuff. One resource, if you guys are interested in designing your own puppets, that I really, really recommend is a gentleman called Adam Krudinger. He has a YouTube channel called Puppet Nerd, and he goes into that style of pattern designing that I was telling you about with the tape, where you design, a undershell and then tape the whole thing and cut out your pattern pieces from that. And, literally any shape that you can want, that is the easiest way to design patterns. Another really good resource, regardless of whether you're wanting to do puppets or if you're wanting to design stuffed animals, or frankly both, is I want to say her name is Abigail Glosson, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. But the book is called Stuffed Animals from Concept to Construction. If you look it up on Amazon, it's a light blue book with a bear on the cover. You will see it if you just look up stuffed animal book. And it goes through a lot of very common pattern and sewing techniques that people will run into questions that they don't know where their answers are going to be coming from. And this book covers almost all of them. So as far as whether you're sewing by hand or if you're using a machine, this book will help you. So again, that's Stuffed Animals from Concept to Construction. First name Abigail. I know it's a G name, but I'm pretty sure it's Glosson. Great book. Wonderful, wonderful resource. So I hope that was helpful. I hope that you enjoyed, a little peek into the progress and, that I'm currently going through with some of these and the process of making all of these lovely toys.
Well, thanks for coming on and sharing your knowledge. And I'm sure everyone has learned something tonight.
Yep. And thank you guys for tuning in. And thank you for having me on.
Of course.
Is there anything you wanted to promote real quick?
Again, everything there is to find Dragonchild wise if you go to dragonchild.net, or if you go to linktree/Dragonchild. I have all of my different links there for you to find, but even the link tree itself is available on dragonchild.net. There you can read the first 3 issues of my comic for free, as well as purchase any of my comics or my plush creations. The newest books that I just got Kickstarted, to be fair, have not been added to that shop yet, but that is on the docket to get taken care of real quick. But yeah, I hope that you guys enjoyed, and yeah, it was a pleasure.
Especially for us too. We love having you on.
And I'm sure we'll see many of the shows coming up here.
Yes. Are you guys going to be at Stockton Winter?
So
maybe. I know Set Geeks has a table, so I'm not sure.
Okay.
Because I am on the board, so if I'm available, I will go.
Yeah. Otherwise, another really great show that we're going to be at that I always... What was that?
I do believe that Sec Winter is actually at the same time as when the Colossus Scroll shows.
Ah, that's fair. That's fair. Yeah, the other one that's coming up is the day after my birthday, so it's on February 15th. And it's in Concord, and that's East Bay Comic Con. It's a really good single day show, so it's just on a Sunday, and tickets I want to say are like $8 or $10. It's really reasonable, and it's just a fantastic group of people. And if you don't want to deal with the madness of, say, a full sack anime, which we just got done doing that show, the crowd size at an East Bay Comic Con is a much more low-key event, but the amount of talent in that couple of rooms is phenomenal. So highly recommend if you guys want to look that up, or if you're going to be in Concord, that one's fantastic. So highly recommend. And on my website as well, I do have updating list of all of the different events that we're going to be at. So if you're ever wondering, hey, where's she going to be at next? It's on my front page. I usually have the upcoming 4, but then clicking on, I have an events tab right above that. You can see literally every single event that we're going to be doing throughout the year. So you can always find me somewhere.
Awesome. So thank you for coming on to the show and showing us how to do the puppets.
Yeah.
But I think it is the time to move on to the next section. So we'll see you at the shows.
Yep. Take care. And thank you again for having me on.
Bye.
Oh, she went off.
All right. So, we are going to run very quickly through these.
So yeah, I'm gonna go through it quick here. I do need a lot of editing because I found a lot more of other events, but coming up this weekend, Fresno has their Anime Wave. It's going to be at the Fresno Fairgrounds both Saturday and Sunday, 17th and 18th. They're going to have cosplay contest vendors. There's photo ops, a lot of celebrity guests, and karaoke. I think they're having karaoke because our friend Not So Snow White is going to be there, and she does all kinds of fun cosplays and sings along to the songs and soundtracks of the people that she cosplays as. So that's always fun and really good, and she's a very talented cosplay friend of ours. So this weekend, if you are in the Fresno area, that is something to check out. You will probably see our good friends Grumpy Cookies, and Frisco of Set Geeks plans to be in attendance there. So if you see him wandering around with his puppy Frank, go ahead and say hey and tell him Sandra told you to come stalk him and pet the dog. And then the following weekend, January 24th, Sat Geeks is having their bi-monthly market at the Lucid Winery. It's called New Year Creators Fair this month, and the general admission is free. We do have VIP tickets. There's only 20 available, so if you guys scan the QR code that is on the flyer there, you go to Sat Geeks social medias and find it there, and you will get your VIP tickets. It is good for one free drink. It could be wine or non-alcoholic, and it gives you access to the mini workshops and a cool gift bag. Guys, they do give away a lot of awesome swag in those VIP bags. Just saying. And also, these events are family friendly, so you can bring the kids along if you wish to. You don't have to, but you can. So again, that's January the 24th at the Lucid Winery on R Street in Sacramento. Now, the following day, I myself, along with my friend Bex, are going to drive out to Pasadena Comic-Con, which in my personal opinion is like a mini Power Morphicon because there are so many Power Ranger actors there. I am looking forward to seeing I'm blanking on their real names, but Bulk and Skull. I so would love to meet them and see them both there. So that is my goal for that Sunday, is to meet both of them. I'm hoping I can make that dream come true and then tell you guys all about it over on Distance Nerdy. So keep your eyes and ears open for that, which is this on Sunday, January 25th in Pasadena in Southern California. Now, ending out the month of January, back up here in Sacramento, we are going to be at VerseCon Comic-Con at the Scottish Rite Center on January 31st and February 1st. It is Dragon Ball themed, so we're going to have a lot of different voice actors from the series there. And there is going to be a cosplay contest ran by Sat Geeks, and it's going to be emceed by Boygan's Cosplays, judges from Cosplay Dropout and Team Inferno. Now there's gonna be signups will be at the Sat Geek table, so you go over there, sign up. The contest starts at 4 p.m. and I'm saying so much about it because actually within Sat Geeks, I'm running the thing. It's gonna be my first time really fully running a cosplay contest, so I am excited and nervous and wanting to make it a great turnout for this convention. So you guys, if you're not doing anything this weekend or you want to geek out and nerd out with us, come over to the Scottish Rite Center January 31st and February 1st to see what VerseCon is all about. Now, guys, we are still on the road to 200 subscribers. Once we get that 200, we're going to be live and giving away all kinds of prizes again, like we did when we hit 100. We have Witcher figures. We have 3D prints. We have, oh my goodness, I don't even remember right now. But we have so much more cool, fun stuff to give away. You guys, spread the word. Tell your friends. Tell your family. Tell your fellow nerds. Tell random people you see at Comic-Cons to subscribe to the Long Fam Cosplay and get us to the 200 mark so you can get prizes. If you're not that local, we will mail it out to you. If you are local, we'll meet up with you and hand deliver it if you want. We don't care. We want to give you free stuff because we want to buy your affection.
Alrighty. Leave that guy up there. So that's going to do it for us today. Thank you for stopping by and learning about some puppets, and we will see you on Wednesday.
Yeah, see you Wednesday.